Tonight we'll drift through 6 simple dishes, each one a quiet comfort from a kitchen past. Some came from seaside cafes, others from humble staff rooms or early morning bakeries, but all of them in their own way are soft steps toward rest. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let the warmth of familiar flavors guide you gently towards sleep. Recipe 1. Soft herb butter scrambled eggs on toast. When I first moved to Paris as a young commis chef, I had only a cot, a pan, and some eggs. My mentor told me, learn to respect the egg, and the rest will come. And I didn't quite understand it at first. I was 17, broke, and impatient. I thought the egg was just breakfast. A filler, something to get you to lunch. But over time, and many cracked shells later, I began to see it. The egg doesn't need to be loud. It's quiet and comforting. And if you take your time, really take your time, it gives you everything. So tonight, before you fall asleep, I'll show you how to make what became my ritual in those early years. Soft herb butter scrambled eggs on toast. Nothing complicated, but made with care. The kind of care that reminds you the world can slow down, even just for a meal. First, the ingredients, nothing fancy. 2 eggs, a knob of good butter, about a tablespoon, a touch of cream if you have it, a pinch of salt, fresh herbs, chives, parsley, maybe tarragon if you're feeling French, a slice of hearty bread, something rustic, something that toasts with a satisfying crunch. That's it. No truffles, no black garlic foam, just eggs and attention. Let's begin. Crack your eggs into a small bowl, preferably ceramic, something that holds warmth. Use a fork, not a whisk. That's what my mentor told me. Let them marry, not froth, he'd say. Stir slowly, like you're folding silk. Now the butter, cold and golden, goes into a pan. Low heat. I mean low. If your pan hisses at you, it's too hot. This isn't a race. Let the butter melt slowly, until it smells slightly nutty and coats the bottom of the pan like a blanket. Now pour the eggs in. Don't stir right away. Let the edges barely set, just enough to whisper to you. Then, with a spatula or a wooden spoon, draw the eggs gently from the edges to the center. Pull, pause, pull again. Think of waves lapping onto a quiet shore. This should take longer than you want it to. That's the point, because in that patience, your eggs go from liquid to velvet. Not firm, not dry, velvet. Add your herbs just before they finish cooking. Chopped fine, so they melt into the curds, and then a dash of cream, right at the end, to stop the cooking. Just a tablespoon. It's like tucking a blanket around them. A good scrambled egg should be warm, not hot, loose, but not runny, soft, like a cloud that chose to land on your plate. Now the toast. If you haven't done so already, put a slice of bread in the toaster or under the grill. Let it brown, but not burn. You want that golden crunch, not charcoal. Spread a bit of butter on it while it's still warm. Let it sink in. And now spoon those eggs, tender, rich, and trembling, right on top. They should spread slightly, nestling into the ridges of the bread. You don't need anything else. No garnish, no ketchup, just a fork, or maybe a spoon, if you want to eat slowly, bite by bite. And here's the thing. I used to eat this at the end of my night shift. The restaurant would go dark, the kitchen would cool, and I'd be alone, the city humming outside, watching the Eiffel Tower flicker in the distance. It was just me and the egg. They reminded me that I'd survived another day, and that morning always comes. Now I still make them, though the restaurant's quieter, and the city's far behind me. But every time I stir those eggs, I remember that young version of me. Broke, tired, but learning. Learning to be gentle, to wait, to let the heat do the work, to trust that small things, done well, matter more than grand gestures. So if you're lying in bed tonight, thinking too much, remember the egg. Remember that a little care, a little patience, and a bit of butter can turn something ordinary into something worth remembering. Close your eyes. That was recipe 1. Honey drizzled ricotta with figs. My grandmother believed that dessert didn't need sugar to be sweet, just ripe fruit and a touch of something creamy. She always made this before bed. In a rushed, never extravagant. She called it her quiet ending, as though every day deserved a soft exhale, instead of a full stop. And now, whenever the world has been a little too loud, or the hours too quick, I make what she used to make, honey drizzled ricotta with figs. Simple, soft, not a dessert that shouts, but one that gently tells you everything's going to be all right. She always started by choosing the figs carefully, never bought in a hurry, and never chosen by looks alone. She'd cradle each one in her palm, feel the weight of it, the give of the skin. Figs are honest, she used to say. They don't lie about being ready. And she was right. A good fig, properly ripe, feels like the sun's still in it, warm, plump, and just about ready to burst with sweetness. You don't need many. 3, maybe 4, depending on their size. More, if you're sharing, which she always hoped you would. She'd lay them gently on the counter, while the kitchen light spilled in from the small window above the sink. She'd never cut them too early. Figs, like stories, need the right moment to open. While they rested, she'd turn to the ricotta. Now this wasn't the kind you find in plastic tubs, cold and stiff. No, this was fresh ricotta. Fluffy, soft, and almost warm from being made just that morning. She always kept a small bowl covered in the fridge, lined with a linen cloth, just in case someone came over late, or the night called for a little comfort. She'd spoon some into a ceramic dish. Never glass. Ceramic held the coolness just right. She said, a few generous spoonfuls, enough to scoop, but not so much it overwhelmed. And she'd take the back of the spoon and smooth it, not to flatten but to make soft waves, like a quiet sea at dusk. That was her way, gentle, thoughtful, never hurried. She believed food should feel like someone had been waiting for you. Then came the figs. She'd slice them open just once, right down the middle, letting the insides fan out, like tiny stained glass windows. Their seeds, glistening, the color of old roses and dusty wine. She'd place them on top of the ricotta, never buried, never hidden. The figs were the moment of truth, always tender, always real. Then, with her fingers sticky from the fruit, she'd reach for the honey. Not the kind in a plastic bear. No, this was amber and thick, kept in a jar with a wooden dipper, and a lid that stuck a little every time. She'd drizzle it slowly, watching the threads of gold fall across the white of the ricotta, and the pink of the figs. Like sunlight caught in syrup. She never used too much, just enough to make it whisper. She'd say, whispered of bees, of wildflowers, of fields far from here. Sometimes, if the night was colder, she'd add a few crushed walnuts, just a pinch, scattered like little echoes. Not always, just sometimes. Texture, she told me, reminds the tongue it's still awake, and then she'd place it on the table, or sometimes bring it over to the sofa, where we'd sit with a blanket folded over our knees, spoons in hand, and the soft sound of the world winding down. I remember the way she'd take that first bite, slow, like she was trying to memorize the flavor. And maybe she was. Maybe she knew that one day, long after she was gone, someone would be sitting here doing the same thing, drizzling the honey, splitting the figs, and remembering. Now I do it often, when the house is quiet, when the day's been long, and I want to remember how small pleasures can still feel sacred. I scoop the ricotta. Gently, I slice the figs. I drizzle the honey in those same golden threads, and I take my time. Because what she taught me wasn't just how to make a dessert. It was how to end the day, kindly. How to take whatever sweetness the world gave you, even if it was only a little, and make it enough. Creamy, soft. So if you're lying in bed tonight, still turning over the day's troubles, let this be your reminder. You don't need much to feel cared for, just a few ripe figs, a spoonful of ricotta, a slow pour of honey, and maybe, if you're lucky, the memory of someone who once made it just for you. Sleep well. Close your eyes. That was recipe 2. Vanilla rice pudding with a cinnamon stick. There was a railway chef I met once who said rice pudding is a hug disguised as food. He used to make a pot every Sunday night for the train crew. Said it kept everyone warm even when the carriages were cold and the schedules unforgiving. He was a quiet man, thick hands and a voice that rumbled like the tracks themselves. But when he talked about rice pudding, something softened in him, as if he could still hear the gentle clink of spoons against porcelain bowls, long after the train had pulled away. He showed me once in the dim galley kitchen of a sleeper car, bound for monorail. The smell alone could calm a whole station. Sweet milk, vanilla, a hint of spice. The kind of scent that makes your shoulders drop without realizing it. We didn't have much space, but that never mattered. Rice pudding doesn't ask for grandeur. It just needs patience and the right kind of attention. He started with short grain rice. Arborio, usually, but he said any rice with a bit of heart to it would do. He poured it into a heavy-bottomed pot, the kind you'd trust with your memories. Then came the milk. Full fat. Always. He said, if you're going to make something comforting, don't be shy about it. Warm the milk slowly. Let it rise in temperature, like a yawn. Not boiling, just enough to lull the rice into softening. And in went the rice and the vanilla bean, split lengthwise, seeds scraped like little flecks of perfume, disappearing into the pale sea. He didn't stir constantly, just enough to make sure it didn't catch. Said the pudding needed room to thicken on its own terms, like letting someone find their way home in the dark, with a porch light on. And through it all, a single cinnamon stick, not ground, not too much, just the stick, gently laid in, as if setting a piece of old wood to drift on a quiet river. It infused the pudding slowly, releasing its warmth like a secret, and we'd sit, sometimes while it cooked, him on an overturned crate, me perched on a flour sack, the train humming beneath us. He told me about his days running meals between sleeping passengers and distant stations. He said rice pudding was his favorite to serve, because even the toughest conductors would soften with a spoonful. It reminds them, he said, that they're still someone's child. After about 30, maybe 40 minutes, depending on the mood of the milk and the rice, the pudding would begin to gather itself. Creamy, thick, but not stiff. He always added a touch of cream near the end, just to round the corners. Then sugar, not much, just enough to lift it. The sweetness shouldn't shout, he said. It should murmur. Once done, he'd ladle it into bowls while it was still loose and warm. The cinnamon stick, tucked off to the side like a relic from a dream. Sometimes he'd dust a bit of nutmeg on top. Just a whisper, but never too much. He believed rice pudding should be subtle, like a good night story told in half light. Now, years later, I still make it on Sunday nights. Sometimes, I put the pot on just as the sky begins to dim. I use the same kind of rice, the same milk, and I always add the cinnamon stick. And as the scent rises, vanilla wrapping around every corner of the kitchen, I remember that trained chef, his hands steady, his eyes kind. I remember how something so simple could carry so much peace. Rice pudding doesn't rush you. It waits. It thickens slowly, without demand, and in that way, it teaches you something. That comfort isn't about extravagance. It's about presence, about warmth, about setting something on the stove, and letting the minutes stretch out like a blanket. So, if tonight feels heavy, if the week ahead looms, remember there's a recipe older than worry. Milk, rice, vanilla, and time. Let them hold you. Let them remind you that you don't always have to be strong, or ready, or anything other than here. Somewhere, even now, I like to believe there's a little railway kitchen still making a pot of rice pudding on a quiet night run. The cinnamon stick turning gently in the steam, the crew waiting, smiling, knowing exactly what's coming. And maybe, tonight, you'll dream of it. A warm bowl in your hands, a spoon, and nothing left to do but rest. Sleep well. Close your eyes. That was recipe 3. Classic butter shortbread cookies. Back when I was starting out at a hotel kitchen in Scotland, an old pastry chef said, "You want to learn patience? Bake shortbread." He had a face like a weathered oak door and hands that seemed to know dough before it even touched the counter. I was young, still all nerves and noise, trying to prove myself that smelled of steam, stock pots, and stories older than I was. But the shortbread station was quiet, always quiet. He gave me one recipe to memorize. Just 3 ingredients. He said, butter, sugar, and flour. But don't let the simplicity fool you, he warned, tapping the edge of his bench with a rolling pin. Shortbread doesn't care how clever you are. It only cares how gently you treat it. We always started with the butter. Good, salted butter, not too soft, never melted, just room temperature, like it had been sitting out waiting for conversation. He said the butter needed to be real. No substitutions, no apologies. You could always taste it. He'd cut it into cubes and leave it to rest in the mixing bowl, while we weighed the sugar. Not much, just enough to sweeten, not overwhelm. About half a cup to a full cup of butter, he'd say. The ratio was sacred. Then came the creaming, not rushed, not whipped, just slowly beaten with a wooden spoon until the sugar and butter surrendered into each other, smooth and pale, like early morning cream. I'd try to hurry it, of course. We always do when we're young. But he'd catch me every time. Let it bloom, he'd mutter. If you rush it, you'll scare the softness out. Once the butter and sugar were coaxed into that perfect hush, we added the flour, all-purpose, sifted slow, like snow falling through your fingers. About 2 cups, he said, but really it was about feel. Too much, and it turned dry. Too little, and it slumped. The dough didn't want to be kneaded. It wanted to be brought together, gently, like pulling a blanket over a sleeping child. When it held its shape without sticking, it was ready. He showed me how to pat it into a rectangle, not roll it. Never roll shortbread. Rolling forces it. He pressed it with his palms, evenly, carefully, until it was about half an inch thick, maybe a bit more. Then he'd take a blunt knife and score lines into it, not to cut all the way through, just to guide it. The marks were quiet, like footpaths on fresh snow, and then came the pricking, a fork, pressed gently into each finger of dough, letting steam escape. Keeps it honest, he said, and beautiful. We baked it low and slow, around 300 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes a touch lower in the old ovens. Shortbread doesn't like high heat. It wants to settle, not rush. About 40 minutes, sometimes longer, just until the edges turn the color of pale straw. No browning, he warned. Once it blushes, you've gone too far. I'd sit on an upturned milk crate while it baked, the scent rising like something ancient. Warm butter, sugar, a hint of salt. It filled the kitchen without fanfare. It didn't shout. It lingered. And when we pulled it from the oven, we let it rest in the pan. Still scored, still warm. We didn't touch it until it cooled completely. That was the final lesson. Waiting. You see, shortbread isn't about flour or butter. It's about restraint, about care. You can't force it to be ready. You have to let it become what it's meant to be, in its own time. And somehow in the quiet hours after service, with the kitchen dim and the windows fogged from the night, I began to understand what he meant. I still make it the same way now, on slow evenings, on days when the world has turned too fast. I take the butter out early. I measure the sugar without thought. I sift the flour, with hands that have finally learned not to rush. And as it bakes, I wait, not with impatience, but with calm, the kind that only comes from doing something the long way, the right way. And when I finally break a finger of it along the scored lines, I still hear that old pastry chef's voice. You want to learn patience? He asked. I did, and I still do, with every bat. Tonight, if you find yourself restless, thinking too far ahead, or looking too far back, remember that some things are meant to be slow, gentle, uncomplicated. 3 ingredients. 1 moment at a time. And maybe tomorrow, you'll wake with that scent still lingering, like a promise folded into flour and butter, that even the quietest things can leave the deepest comforts. Sleep well. Close your eyes. That was recipe 4. Lavender and honey milk. Legend has it, Queen Elizabeth I drank warm milk with lavender before sleep to calm her royal nerves. I've kept the tradition alive in my own way, not out of royalty, mind you. I've no crown, no court, but because sometimes at the end of a day, worn thin with thoughts, nothing stills the mind quite like this simple, ancient cup. I first learned about it in an herb garden, in the Cotswolds of all places, tucked behind a stone cottage where I was doing a summer apprenticeship. The garden belonged to a retired herbalist, a quiet woman who never raised her voice, but could coax sweetness from bark and blossom alike. She told me about the Queen's bedtime brew one evening, as we stood surrounded by swaying sprigs of lavender under a twilight sky. You must treat the lavender gently, she said, brushing her fingertips along the stalks. If you bruise it, it becomes perfume. But if you steep it softly, it becomes peace. That night, I tried it for myself. I warmed some milk, just enough for a single mug, in a small pan. Not to boiling, no bubbles, just a gentle steam that made the surface quiver like a still lake stirred by breath. It's important not to rush that part. Milk needs coaxing, not commanding. I've always found that warming milk slows your own pace, whether you mean it to or not. Once the milk was warm, I added a teaspoon or so of dried culinary lavender. Not much, just enough for it to whisper its floral notes, not shout. You see, lavender is bold in its own way. It only takes a little to cast a long shadow. So I stirred it in slowly and let it steep, right there in the pan, with the heat tamed off and the kitchen lights dimmed. 5 minutes, maybe a touch more, depending on how tired the day has left you. Then comes the honey. Local if I can get it. I'm partial to wildflower honey myself. 2 teaspoons, sometimes 3, enough to balance the herbaceous bloom of lavender with something round and golden, stirred in while the milk is still warm, just before straining. It is best to use a fine mesh sieve or even a bit of cheesecloth if you're feeling particular. The lavender blossoms are lovely in the garden, but not so much between your teeth. And once it's strained, you're left with something still, something quiet, a mug of warm milk, blushed with lavender and honey, steam curling softly above the rim. I usually pour it into a thick ceramic cup, the kind that holds warmth in your hand, the kind that makes you stop, just for a moment, and feel the weight of the evening settle down. I've made it in many kitchens since then, in bustling cities where horns echo off brick walls, in countryside inns where the only sound at night is the turning of pages and the distant creak of old wood, even once in a tent while camping under stars, with milk warmed in a battered tin pot over a campfire. And every time it brings the same hush, the same slow unclenching of thoughts. I often sip it by the window, watching the last of the world go by. A single light in a neighbor's flat, a cat padding across the street, the moon caught in the branches of a sleeping tree. There's something ceremonial about it, really. Not elaborate, not grand, but intentional. You measure, you steep, you sweeten, you strain. It asks nothing complicated of you, only that you be present for a few quiet minutes. And in return, it gives you sleep. Not the sudden drop of exhaustion, but the slow drift of ease. I think of Queen Elizabeth sometimes, sitting in some high-walled room, miles from sleep, perhaps staring at a ledger of wars and treaties. And I wonder if she too held her cup in both hands and let the scent of lavender undo the knots in her chest. There are some comforts, after all, that cross centuries. So if tonight feels like too much, or too fast, or too loud, if your thoughts keep circling like gulls over water, I suggest you make yourself a cup. Warm the milk, add a pinch of lavender, stir in some honey, let it steep, then sit with it, quietly, slowly. Let it be a ritual, not for royalty, but for yourself. And if you sleep a little deeper tonight, perhaps that's the lavender, or perhaps it's simply the feeling of being cared for, even if only by your own hands. Rest well now. Close your eyes. That was recipe 5. Simple tomato basil pasta with garlic oil. When I worked the line in Florence, the kitchen always closed with this dish. Not with a grand roast or a flambéed dessert, but with a simple plate of pasta, tomato, basil, and garlic oil. Nothing fancy, nothing showy, just pure, honest flavor, passed down like a handshake at the end of a long day. Every cook took home a portion, and somehow it always tasted better the next morning. But the making of it, that was the true comfort. You'd think after 12 hours of shouting orders, slicing, searing, and plating, we'd want something more elaborate. But there's a kind of peace in simplicity. And in that kitchen, as the lights dimmed and the last guests left, we'd gather around the stove like moths to a fading flame. We always started with the garlic. A few cloves, never minced, always sliced thin. Not too thin, mind you, just enough so that each piece would crisp gently. Not burn. We'd warm good olive oil in a pan, the kind that smelled of late summer fields, and let the garlic dance until golden. You had to watch it closely. Garlic has a moment when it turns from sweet to bitter. Miss it, and the whole dish changes its tune. When it turned that perfect shade of amber, we'd lift it off the heat, letting the oil settle, fragrant and calm. Then came the tomatoes. Back then, we used what we had, sometimes fresh ones, soft and bursting, from the midday market, sometimes good quality canned San Marzanos, when the season passed. We'd crush them by hand right into the oil, the juice hissing as it met the heat. It always startled someone, even when you knew it was coming. That's part of the joy, really. Food should wake you before it lulls you. The tomatoes would simmer down slowly, never rush. A pinch of salt, a touch of sugar if they were too sharp, and sometimes a splash of the starchy pasta water to help it all come together. I remember one of the older cooks telling me that pasta sauce, like wine, needs to breathe. Don't stir too much, he'd say, waving me off. Let it think. While the sauce found its way, we'd drop the pasta. Spaghetti, usually. Sometimes linguine. Always al dente, never soft. We salted the water like the sea, and stirred just once, then left it alone. You can learn a lot about patience from boiling water. When it was ready, we lifted it straight into the sauce. No draining, no fuss. The heat, the starch, the oil, it all came together in one pan, like an orchestra finding its rhythm at the end of a long rehearsal. Then just before finishing, we'd add the basil, torn by hand, never chopped. Chopping bruises the leaves, dulls the scent, but tearing keeps it alive. The fragrance was like stepping out into an herb garden. Just after it rained, we'd toss it through the pasta, letting the warmth coax out its green, peppery note. And always a final drizzle of that garlic oil over the top, with maybe a few of those golden slivers saved aside. We never plated it in the restaurant's fine dishes, just big steel bowls or ceramic plates, passed hand to hand. We'd eat standing, leaning against counters, or perched on crates. The night still humming outside, but the kitchen finally quiet. That pasta didn't need cheese or cream or flair. It had soul. It tasted like what the day had been, long, real, and somehow still good. And the next day, when we opened our lunch bags or containers, it was even better. The garlic had mellowed, the basil had settled, and the tomatoes, oh, the tomatoes, had deepened into something soft and sweet. It was the kind of meal that felt like a friend, one who knew you were tired, that didn't ask for anything more than your presence. I still make it today when I need grounding. When the world feels too fast or too clever, I slice the garlic, I warm the oil, I crush the tomatoes with my hands, and I tear the basil just before it touches the heat. No rules, just rhythm, just memory, just flavor. And perhaps before bed tonight, you might imagine it, that warm pan, that simple sauce, the comfort of something made with care. You don't need a kitchen in Florence to feel it. Just a few ingredients, a quiet space, and a willingness to let things be simple. Sleep well now. Let the day simmer down like tomatoes in oil. Let the basil rise in your breath, and let your thoughts tangle like pasta, soft and winding, toward rest. Close your eyes. That was recipe 6. Having trouble sleeping? I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep. Having trouble sleeping. I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep. having trouble sleeping. I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep. having trouble sleeping. I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep. Having trouble sleeping. I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep. Having trouble sleeping. I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep. Having trouble sleeping. I was once young and ambitious and had many sleepless nights. When I need to fall asleep, I may read, I may have a snack, but I always pull back fond memories to soothe my mind. Never of my restaurant and achieving my Michelin stars, but always of my first week at Hotel St. George, or learning the way to truly cook at the Box Tree. And finally, when I became a man at Le Gavroche. Search for your own memories, forget the troubles awaiting you, and drift off keeping in mind these recipes for sleep.